Whether I like it or not, Inti Creates clearly wants Copen to be the Zero of the Gunvolt universe, and like Zero, he's got his own franchise now. Which is a double-edged sword, because he's a really enjoyable character to control, with really expressive movement and a unique rhythm of play, but he was also a horribly unlikable and poorly written character who we'd be stuck with for the entire ride. I had a few harsh words for Copen in the last video, but neglected to give him a proper introduction, so here we go. If the superpowered adepts are essentially just mutants from X-Men, then that would make Copen Tony Stark or Bruce Wayne, the wealthy, gadget-themed superhero with a tragic backstory involving at least one murdered parent. What separates Copen from those guys is he's intentionally framed as a bigoted character. His sole mission in life is to kill every adept in the world, with no exceptions. His reason for doing this is because adepts pose a threat to humanity, and his dad wanted him to, I think? It's never really made clear. The series seems afraid to make Dr. Kamizono an actual character, because then the developers would have to admit that he's actually the main character from Galgun. But because of that, it's hard to tell how much of Copen's worldview are based on his own conclusions and how much was inspired by his father. He ends up feeling like a character who just isn't finished, and like the story hasn't fully been told. And what better opportunity to explore Copen's history and backstory than in his own franchise? This is the perfect time to finally get a look at what makes this guy tick, and what turned him into the vapid monster he is today. The awfully titled Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Avenger X picks up right where Act 2 left off and follows Copen's battle with the Sumeragi Corporation and the adepts under their control. So, does this series redeem Copen as a character and make the most of his dramatic potential while fleshing out his mechanics? What, do you want me to just tell you? Copen is our only player character this time around, and his core moveset really hasn't changed that much from Act 2. He still uses his bullet system, which gives him a 6-direction air dash, he still marks enemies, he still has his fast fall, his passive shield and pre-evasion are still intact. He's pretty much unchanged, which isn't a problem, but Copen still had a few kinks that needed to be ironed out. One problem that was fixed was Copen's hover. It can now be activated manually instead of having to be automated. But a lot of other issues have unfortunately gone ignored. After landing a dash, Copen will still hop into the air, usually into a hazard. I've never understood why the player can't decide which direction Copen bounces in after hitting an enemy. When Copen's out of ammo, the visual cue is really hard to see, and after you do something sick in the air, you're probably not thinking about how you need to reload. I wouldn't mind if just hitting the ground gave you your ammo back, considering doing that will end your combo. After Copen banks off a wall, there's a really brief window where if you press the jump button, it'll cancel his dash, but it won't activate the hover, meaning you'll try to hover over an attack and Copen will just fall right into it. Having to press the jump button twice to get the hover out just feels really unresponsive. Copen is a pretty complex character for an action platformer and requires some complex controls. And the fact that the controls aren't up to snuff leads to a lot of frustration and mistakes that aren't really the player's fault. While his core hasn't changed that much, the sub-weapons are at least more interesting this time around. Stellar Spark is back and is your go-to DPS source. Orbital Edge can destroy crates. Shroud Spear doesn't deal any damage, but basically removes enemies for a few seconds, which includes some enemies that can't be damaged. Rising Cyclone is a mid-air jump. Photon Detonator and Muse's Kiss primarily deal damage, but at least have area of effect and piercing properties respectively. Sub-weapons can now be mapped to the right joystick in case you have a few favorites you want to get to quickly. They don't add Kudos, which means you get a lower score, but your final time is now incorporated into your score as a multiplier, so in a way killing enemies faster might be better for your score in the long run. Certainly a step in the right direction, as they all don't just deal damage, but they aren't all equally interesting. Point in question, Anchor Nexus. Anchor Nexus could practically be its own game. It turns Copen's air dash into a homing attack that can hit from any direction. If Copen's offensive dash brought movement and combat together, then Anchor Nexus is the wedding ring. This is basically the only sub-weapon you're ever going to be using, because it's just so damn good. Bouncing Copen through levels, crashing into enemies, chaining air combos, backflipping off of them, and pelting them with homing shots while Lola cheers you on, well, it's pretty fun. Turns this game into Rocket Knight Adventure 2 battle. It can feel automated, but if you just mash the dash button, you're gonna end up getting hit, so you need to pay attention. Pressing the sub-weapon button will have Lola mark your next victim, and pressing it again will deactivate it. You'll actually want to do that in case you need to manually aim a dash. The default layout is one of the face buttons, but I recommend putting it on one of the triggers so you can do it easily while keeping your thumb on the jump and shoot buttons. One nice detail is that using Anchor Nexus now costs 1 point from your meter, which means it'll never run out, but while it's active, you can't use the flash field, which means using it is a calculated risk, which I think is a fair trade-off. It almost feels like Anchor Nexus should have been a function outside of the sub-weapon system, which it could have been since there are 2 sub-weapon buttons for no reason. It's really crazy how much this one sub-weapon kind of becomes the core of this game's design. You can even see it in how levels are laid out, encouraging the player to bounce around while maintaining their momentum. This game nearly earns a recommendation on Anchor Nexus alone. Overdrive is a mechanic that was in As2, but I was so bad at that game I never really noticed it. It's a state that activates when you break 1,000 Kudos. There were chips in that game that only activated when in Overdrive, but they were all pretty expensive and I never got much use out of them. It's a great addition to the Kudos checkpoint system, as it gives the player a mechanical reason to avoid checkpoints. Kudos goes from being a scoring system to being a resource that the player cultivates through skillful play. I feel like if you were playing on the punishing Kudos system, you always knew if you were skipping checkpoints or not. It was a choice that you made once and then never again. Cautious did lead to the player asking, can I get to the next checkpoint, and only get hit twice, which made it a decision that fluctuates a little bit. The problem is that on its own it doesn't really do anything other than just draw an X on Copen and change the music. There are a few cool upgrades, like the one that restores your health or increases your damage, or the one that gives you infinite dashes, but these are all really expensive, and I didn't have enough for any of them after finishing the game. And you're tripping if you think I'm grinding for this. This isn't helped by the fact that your score has no real effect on how much money you get at the end. Like, doesn't that sound like a good idea? Getting a better score, giving you more money to unlock new abilities? Isn't that an incentive to play better? I also wish that the music that played during overdrives was a little bit more shonen. It's just a little too glitzy and cutesy, considering the dire circumstances of this game's story. I'm not saying the game needs to have male vocals or anything, but it's still an action game, so I think the music should make me want to get up to rock and get up to burn, you know? Something that makes me want to kick some ass. I found myself turning off the music since listening to really high energy J-pop can get kinda tiring. I preferred it in the first game, where lyrics would only start in boss fights. I think that's a moment where it makes dramatic sense to have vocals in a track instead of just whenever you're doing well. It almost punishes the player for doing well. If you ever want to turn the J-pop off, you can always just bust out Copen Super, as it still ends your Kudos chain. Copen now only has one super. His manual heal is gone, but one of the upgrades in the menu restores his health whenever you use it, so you never have to choose between which one you want in a pinch. It still stops time with no invincibility frames after, meaning you can't really use it to dodge attacks, and if you get hit while your health is being restored, the game makes sure to subtract that from the health you get back. Wow. Thanks, game. I really wish the animation didn't take so long, especially since it's a single button press now, and if you press it by mistake, you're locked into it. It's also not much of an interaction, as you just press the button, and unless they're invincible, which they are a lot, they take damage. It doesn't need to be aimed or really ask anything of the player, and unless you want to get your health back, there's no reason to not just wait till the end of the fight, since you even get a point bonus for finishing with it. I think a move is poorly designed if there's an optimal time and place to use it. Each stage now holds 4 hidden emblems. They give you 500 points when you collect them. This makes it easier to get into overdrive, but it also means if you're going for a high score, you need to collect them every time. Collecting something once can be a fun diversion, but having to collect them each time turns them into a tedious chore. One more reason I don't know if I'd ever try to S-rank this game. They're pretty well hidden, and I had some fun looking for them, but when I found out I wouldn't really get anything just for collecting them, I didn't even bother getting them in the gauntlet stages. Collecting them on their own doesn't unlock anything, but if you collect all the emblems, beat every mission, beat every secret mission, beat every mission again, including the secret missions, in time attack mode, you can unlock the option to refight bosses. Bosses who at this point you'll be sick to death of, considering in order to unlock this, you need to fight each of them 7 times. It's honestly the kind of feature you should just get for clearing the game. This is the kind of work that should unlock like a crazy super mode or get Copen to take his clothes off. Early levels are almost all linear hallways with no gimmicks or platforming and give a really bad first impression of the game. Later levels have plenty of bottomless pits and spiked walls to give you some exciting segments to weasel your way through and feel way more attuned to Copen's mechanics. But I wouldn't say they make the most of them. They lack a sense of climax and pacing, preventing them from feeling like really excellent levels. The best level is the factory. It has this one segment with a big moving platform over a huge bottomless pit. I love trying to outrun it and get to the other side without it. It shows how Copen's movement gives the player a greater degree of agency than most platforming characters. This is an auto-scroller done right. If each level had a really memorable moment like this, then they'd probably stand out more. These last levels aren't great, but they're still good. I get wanting to ease the player in, but the first couple of levels are really dire, and it's unfortunate because that's almost half the game. Right as the levels are starting to get interesting, The game ends. There are only 6 main bosses in this game, and only 2 fortress stages. And by 2, I mean 1 and a boss gauntlet. LA really runs out of steam towards the end, which is a shame because it's not really like it was a super consistent ride from the beginning. I feel like the developers can create really interesting characters mechanically, but that the level design remains the weakest link for whatever reason. And a character who's fun to control can only take you so far. So we pick back up where Copen's ending left off, with him abandoning his previous life so he can continue hunting adepts. Sumeragi seems to have changed their business strategies a little bit, going from using adepts as military assets to trying to wipe out the human race. It's a bit of a jump. It's almost like they needed to make the evil corporation more evil to make the unlikable hero more sympathetic. When fighting Sumeragi troops, he encounters an especially powerful adept called Blade, who casually defeats Copen with a single strike before he gets rescued by a human girl named Kohaku. She takes him back to her secret hideout where the resistance is taking shelter. Kohaku and these twerps are our support characters this time around, and this dump is our base of operations. Copen is in the neighborhood looking for a supercomputer called the Butterfly Effect that, when destroyed, will just stop all Sumeragi troops all over the world. That's the justification for why we have to run through another lineup of Sumeragi interns who Copen can make cool sub-weapons out of. It's not terribly compelling, as it just seems like doing this will just fix everything overnight. Once again, Sumeragi doesn't have a face for us to direct our ire at, so it just feels like we're fighting villains who don't seem to answer to anyone. There is mention of a supervisory AI called Demerzel, but it's not really treated like a character. The new characters really don't help make this contrived premise any more compelling. When Mary said she might thank Copen for saving Kohaku, it was the first time I ever got the impression that she wasn't supposed to like him, and I just thought, is this supposed to be a character arc? Or some sort of sad joke? By the end of the game, you still feel like you barely know these characters. When they said they were going to tag along for the final mission, I just started laughing because what are they going to do? Once again, putting all the characterization to the side where you don't have to experience it makes it hard to give them a presence in the story. And I didn't feel any more attached to them after watching all the optional dialogue on YouTube, which is what I'm always going to do because it's more convenient than watching it in-game. The actual stages are pretty disconnected from the story. There's a little plot in the middle where Kohaku gets sick and we have to find a cure for her illness. In her fever, she calls out for her sister, who is definitely dead by the way. On the way to find the cure, we run into Blade. We have a rematch, she goes into sicko mode, and hearing Kohaku's name makes her really angry for some reason, but stuns her long enough for Copen to snag the medicine. Afterwards, Kohaku is fine, and we move on to the next lineup of bosses. I think this segment might have had a little more impact if Kohaku didn't instantly get better and she had a useful function that we'd have to make do without, but she doesn't, and this segment only really exists to set up the mystery of who Kohaku's sister is, which is already incredibly obvious if you've experienced at least one story in your life. I really wish I could tell you that I did a full 180 going from having enough of this guy to being willing to commit self-harm for him, but that just isn't the case. Copen is a lot less hateable in this one, as he's abandoned his quest to kill all adepts, and even seems like he wants to avoid fighting if he can, but he's just so boring. He still speaks in a dry monotone, and his interactions with bosses amount to nothing more than, "You're that ninja." I was really surprised just how little he actually speaks in these scenes. Moments where his dryness is used for deadpan comedy are few and far between, and he doesn't even have moments where he roasts bosses like the last game. Is that really all I have to say about Copen? Yeah, he's less hateable, but hating him was still more fun than this. Kohaku fills the role that Jewel filled in previous games. She seems to be an engineer, as she repairs machines and weapons, and even says that she can tune up Copen's suit. All things that could have affected gameplay, but don't. The game weirdly clarifies that she doesn't know how any of these machines work, because God forbid she actually be competent at something, wouldn't want the player to feel insecure having to work with a girl who has any idea what she's doing. I have to give Kohaku the award for the least believable character in the entire series. I'm just going to tiptoe past the fact that she's basically in her underwear the entire game and focus on her character. Kohaku is just way too energetic and happy considering how absolutely dire her situation is. A genocidal regime consisting exclusively of people with superpowers are trying to kill her. Anyone living under these circumstances would be jaded and miserable from living in a world that's been so cruel to them. This should be the kind of character who hears the legend of the Luminous Avenger and thinks it's a bunch of nonsense, and her encounter with Copen could be the thing that reignites her will to fight. Alternatively, if you want to preserve her optimism, Kohaku could have grown up in a human sanctuary somewhere safe from Sumeragi, where she could have had a comparatively normal upbringing, and the inciting incident could have been Sumeragi discovering it. If you need to have a character like this in your story, you can make it work. The developers decided they wanted to have a scantily clad Genki girl who could tell the player how cool and handsome they were, but didn't stop to think whether or not that made any sense for the story they were trying to tell, or did and didn't care. This is a problem with a lot of Japanese storytelling, mainly video games and anime. It seems like catering to a selection of archetypes and fetishes is a higher priority than creating interesting characters and stories, and as someone who grew up loving Japanese games and anime, this just isn't why I ever came to them in the first place. Wow, that was poor word choice. I'm going to talk a lot of trash about Blade, so I want to make it clear that despite everything, she's still one of my favorite characters in the series, which really isn't high praise, but she's just cool on a base level. I am 12 for a badass lightning samurai with an Oni mask. Okay, are you guys ready? Blade is Kohaku's sister. That's right, the entire time, Blade was secretly Kohaku's sister. Blade. That's just what her name is. I don't know why the game bothers treating this like a twist when we have seen this story so many times we know exactly what's going to happen. A young character, usually a sibling, goes missing, shows back up working for the villains, usually wearing a mask, usually with a sword. Char Aznable, Proto Man, Leon, Racer X, Kylo Ren, The Masked Man, Nello, and Jello. We know exactly who Blade is the moment Kohaku mentions having a sister, because she's the only character in the plot we don't immediately kill, so why even bother keeping it a secret when there's more juicy potential drama in having these characters in conflict with one another? Blade spends the entire game brainwashed by Sumeragi, which robs her of any agency as a character. They should just flat out tell us that Kohaku's sister either joined or was kidnapped but willfully works for Sumeragi. She works for them and they let her sister live. That would explain why her idiot sister, who can't even dress herself, hasn't been killed 8 times over. Blade can offer Kohaku a way out in the form of a septima transplant, and she refuses and stays with Copen. When she and Copen fight, it matters more because they aren't just fighting to survive, they're fighting over which one of them can decide what's best for Kohaku. Copen trying to support her in her beliefs, and Blade trying to save her from certain death. And Blade ends her story by coming to terms with the fact that she was willing to let the human race die to save her sister. I think it would give her a real internal conflict. Does she try and save herself and her sister, or does she stand with humanity and fight a losing war? Would she even be able to fight without the septima she was given? And would saving her sister be worth it when she'd only resent her for it? She's an awesome piece of concept art, but I want her to be an awesome character, and reducing her to a brainwashed pawn robs her of any agency and just makes her story fall completely flat for me. The game does make an effort to try and humanize the bosses, which I appreciate. Each has an understandable motivation, like a prisoner bargaining for a sentence reduction if he kills us, so we can see his family. I still don't like him though. He reminds me of that one character from Danganronpa, you know the one. I don't know what his name is, the fingers in his ass guy. This sexy anthropomorphized lime is fighting to protect her walking vibrator, who Sumeragi will confiscate from her if she doesn't kill us, who then comes back to fight us to get revenge. Tornado Soprano is trying to get his family out of the clink, see? Idola is trying to kill us as a part of a publicity stunt. This one's a bad example. I don't remember what Bon Voyage's goal was, and I don't care. I appreciate the attempt at fleshing out the bosses, but I'd be lying if I said I saw them as anything other than just one-off bosses. I think the problem is that they can't do anything more than just show up and fight the player once, and because of that, bosses are all they're ever going to be. Bosses in this game are a big improvement on the last game. Not as many of them just crash right into you and have much more predictable movements. On my first time through, I got stuck on Black Bull and Tornado Soprano for a while, but it was that good kind of stuck, where you're fighting the boss over and over again, but each death feels like it's your fault, and you're slowly figuring out how to avoid each attack until you finally edge out that last hit. It's the kind of experience I really love when it comes to boss fights, and it's one I can't get out of a game with a live system. Idola was also really fun, although she's not nearly as difficult. Her fight had lots of clear telegraphing without making it too easy, and her DM is one of the few where you can actually counterattack, in addition to not being stupidly difficult to dodge, and okay, I'll just say it, she's really cute. These fights get a thumbs up for me. Unfortunately, Blade gets caught right in the middle. She carries on some of the frustrating design trends from Ass 2 as she has a lot of attacks that come out really quickly, like her lunge and this uppercut. Also, her Captain Commando anti-air is a telegraph for this blade beam attack, which is pretty reactable, but the bolt itself just comes out and swats you out of the air. This wouldn't be a problem, but staying in the air is the safest place to be, since most of her grounded attacks come out so quickly you can't react to them. Captain Corridor also gets rid of your markers, and since she can do that from any attack, punishing it becomes the only consistent opening since she can just whip it out whenever she wants. But even that's not safe since she can just cancel the move into itself. Running on her sword is pretty cool, and she actually has one of the few desperation moves that's actually fun to dodge. But there's just so much holding this boss back from just being a cool, solid fight. She just looks so cool, she deserves so much better. Naturally, boss weapons create a rock, paper, scissors system where certain bosses are weak to other weapons. I haven't seen weaknesses this debilitating since Jet's Stink Ray. It just completely disables some bosses and turns the fights into a joke. I actually really like that slicing off Bon Voyage's claws makes it so you can't block your shots, making him more vulnerable and making the fight actually tolerable. The gauntlet variations of these fights make it so that they don't flinch when hit with their weaknesses, which is good in the case of Tornado Soprano since you actually have to fight him then, but Dr. Fingers and Bon Voyage, you get to realize just how enjoyable the fights are without them. I don't really know if I think weaknesses should be this strong, but if you really hate a boss, it's nice to have an option to just completely clown them. One problem many of the bosses share are overly generous invincibility frames, like how Dr. Fingers takes just a little bit longer than you'd expect him to actually appear when teleporting, or how when the green M&M does her little twirl, she's still invincible even after the animation is over. This will lead you to dashing into them only to miss your mark and not get the punish. As2 also had this problem where the particle effects of Copen's gun were so bright that they'd actually make it hard to tell what the boss was doing. The particles are slightly smaller this time, but it still blocks out the enemy, making it impossible to tell what they're going to do next. Oh, and if you think that's bad, wait till you get a load of the photon detonator. Which is a shame because the telegraphing is mostly better in this game. A lot of them are a little too quick to attack out of their vulnerability windows, so you'll dash into them just to get hit by their next attack. It might help if bosses had a helpless state after you mark them so you could get a little bit of damage in before they start up their next attack. A lot of them have methods of removing your markers, which is something I liked in As1, as it allowed a natural ebb and flow, as some bosses would disappear after their attacks, meaning you could hit them during their attacks, but would have to line up your shots again after. In LA, they have specific attacks that remove markers, and it just feels arbitrary. These mark-removing attacks kind of make the fight more linear and limits which openings the player can actually take advantage of. Desperation moves are still in this game, and while they're not all bad, they're still long, drawn-out attacks that put the fight on hold. DMs aren't rewarding since on successful runs, you'll end up just soaking them up and just losing health, but the alternative would be to make them instant kills, which wouldn't be fun either. Boss fights definitely benefit from a sense of escalation, but I think it's possible to do that without making DMs into these pace-breaking spikes in difficulty. The fights are a serious step in the right direction, and I've enjoyed about half of them, but the overall design shows a lot of room for improvement. This is also the first time they don't even justify why there's a boss gauntlet. They're just back to fight you despite very clearly dying in the initial fight. Wrapping up the boss gauntlet has Copen finally find the butterfly effect, and he laments that this is where Sumeragi has been keeping his sister? What? But the last time we saw her, she was fine. She was better than ever. When did this happen? Was it covered in one of those audio dramas? Was there a tie-in manga I missed? Seems like kind of a major thing to happen off screen. So this giant enlarged brain is Middle. What's left of her anyway. Eventually, the brain is defeated and Middle thanks us for killing her. Then we come face to face with Demerzel. Oh hey Asimov, you know Sumeragi's supervisory AI? That's me. What? How is this guy even alive? First Sumeragi's out trying to wipe out humanity, now we're resurrecting and killing characters off screen? Some pretty bold storytelling decisions for a spin-off. It just makes you wonder, while all this is going on, what's Gunvolt doing? Oh. Luminous Avenger X isn't actually a sequel to Azure Striker 2. It's a sequel to the first game. To the first game's bad ending. In that timeline, Asimov takes over the Sumeragi Corporation and uses their military might to spend the next century waging war in his goal to cleanse the Earth of the human race, giving up his human form so he can live on as an AI, while Copen remained to fight back, eventually losing his body and becoming a machine in the process. After all, no human could live that long. I was pretty amazed by the audacity of this twist on my first playthrough. Seriously, how many other series would create a sequel to the bad ending of their game? It's pretty well hidden for most of the game, and on replay some things stand out, but on my first playthrough I just accepted that this was what happened right after the second game. It really sent me for a loop. On my first playthrough. On replay, I realized that this twist was kind of the only string to the story's bow, and part of the reason why it hit so hard the first time was by this point, I was so disengaged by the story that the strangeness of it all jolted me to attention. And since a plot twist can't really shock you more than once, there's really nothing here. When Copen and Asimov fight, they're just like, what? You're still alive? I haven't seen you in like 100 years. What happened, man? Copen and Asimov's ignorance of each other just makes both of them look stupid. Instead of building them up as this century-long battle being fought in the blind spot of the world stage, this is just the first time these two have seen each other since the first game, and I don't know how that's supposed to add to the story other than just making them seem completely oblivious. Copen lectures Asimov about how he's used innocent people to get what he wants, when he should be frothing at the mouth with white-hot fury aimed at the man who ruined his life. And Asimov is just kind of shrugs and says, we were never going to see eye to eye, so let's just fight. Asimov is the antagonist of Copen's story, and the game should have acted like it. I joked about how Copen seemed to blame everything bad that happened to him on Gunvolt, but Asimov is literally responsible for everything bad that's happened to him. If Copen was what Gunvolt feared humanity to be, then Asimov is what Copen's feared depths to be. He's an unrestrained force of nature with no reservations about abusing that power. He's the final boss of Copen's worldview, and he just seems kind of annoyed. All the catharsis that should come with bringing the hammer down on someone who has so thoroughly wronged you, it's just not here. My favorite thing about this ending is the context that adds to both of their characters. How Asimov couldn't have killed Gunvolt without Copen's gun, so he's partially responsible for the culling of humanity. And how Asimov talked about wiping out humanity like it was going to take a week, when it ended up taking him over 100 years, and the deaths of everyone he's ever loved. Like, this epic final battle is being fought between the two people whose stupidity destroyed the world. Asimov reveals his true form, and we have another terrible final boss. Once again, Copen gets defeated in a cutscene, which leaves Kohaku to deal the final blow. Blade and Kohaku carry Copen from the wreckage, and the day is saved. Luminous Avenger shows the same storytelling potential for this series that the mainline games do, which makes it very frustrating because it feels like all the pieces are in place for a really great story. I think the biggest problem is the cast. They just aren't very dynamic. The hero ends his story the way he began it, the villain doesn't repent before he dies. The closest we get is Blade snapping out of her mind control, but it's not like she as a person has learned anything about herself or the world around her. She's just back to being the person she was supposed to be. One of the biggest problems with this story is that it just feels so short, like we don't have any time to get to know these characters. It feels like the events have no weight at all. We never get a sense of the emotional toll the events of the story have. It just passes through you with only the vaguest recollection that something happened at all. If you put a gun to my head and make me pick which of the series' horrible villains was my favorite, I'd probably pick Asimov. I think he has, or had, the most potential to be an interesting character, as a dark reflection of our hero. In reality, all he's ever been is a one-dimensional genocidal maniac, and Luminous Avenger doubles down on that aspect of his character. The game had a really clear opportunity to redeem Asimov. If we got to see him meditate on his actions in the first game, what he thought would lead him to a better world which only created more problems and suffering at the cost of people he cares about, and how much of a mistake killing Gunvolt was that even 100 years later he still couldn't forgive himself, rather than making it seem like he was completely happy with his life decisions and like he never cared about Gunvolt to begin with. But because they wanted his presence to be an epic twist, we barely get to see him. They could have given him a cool suit and face-obscuring mask and make him look like a badass villain who the player would want to throw down with, and give the game time to establish his presence as a villain, so when we find out he was actually Asimov the whole time, we actually care. I really like that Gunvolt isn't in this game. It just feels more realistic that the main character isn't so important that one wrong move could get him completely erased from history, when they could have brought him back as like a lightning ghost or something. But just because he doesn't appear, it doesn't mean his relationship with Asimov couldn't have been explored through another character. It's never stated, but the implication is that Blade has Gunvolt Septima, as she says it was an implant. Asimov gives Blade GV Septima, but we never get to see the two interact or get a sense of what they think about each other, since Blade is just brainwashed the whole time. I think there's potential for a really interesting relationship between these two. Blade would realistically feign loyalty and hate him deep down, but she could come to pity him once she realizes what he really is. And he could try to use her to replace the bond that was broken when he killed Gunvolt. It could also imply that someone had the Septima before her, since it doesn't really make sense he'd sit on it for 100 years, but would also create some tension between them as to whether or not her predecessors shared the same fate as Gunvolt. Asimov could be this sad, ancient figure, always longing for companionship, but terrified that the moment anyone gets too close is the moment they betray you. And Blade would have every reason to betray Asimov, since he's responsible for everything bad that's happened to her. She could even have a conflict with other adepts who don't view her as one of them, since her Septima isn't natural, and this could make her and Asimov kindred spirits, as his Septima was an implant as well, and that his goal could be less of wantonly killing all of humanity and more about giving what's left of humanity Septima so they can be part of his ideal world, since he realizes what he's done is wrong, but feels like he's too far in to just stop, which is a goal that someone deluded enough can see as doing the right thing, instead of just making him a genocidal maniac. And also, just get rid of Middle's brain. Just have Asimov find some new host for Hatsune Miku. In fact, I think I know just the girl. I think the game could have also redeemed Copen as a character, actually exploring his cold and utilitarian thinking and showing how when taken to the furthest extreme, he's really no better than the people he's fighting, instead of sanitizing what was actually interesting about the character. And through his interactions with Kohaku and various bosses, Copen can be reminded of the aspects of his humanity that he's abandoned on his quest for revenge, instead of having all that self-reflection and character growth happen off-screen. Copen's adept bigotry is just missing in action, which is his whole character. I feel like the story uses adepts in a really strange way. The only adepts we see are bosses who all get sympathetic motivations, but none of them are actually doing the right thing. There are no adepts who stand against Sumeragi, no double agents, no human sympathizers, no adept-led resistance, no prideful adept rebel for Copen to butt heads with. It ironically portrays adepts how Copen Prime would view them. It feels like a world that would have deepened his hatred for adepts, not diminished it. It's his nightmare come to life, and we never get an answer as to how or why he changed. Honestly, I'm just inferring that he did change, since his demeanor is less venomous than in previous games. The hardest thing about criticizing this character is just how little he actually speaks in this game. It makes it impossible to tell what he believes or what's motivating him. I also think that his relationship with Kohaku is one of the weakest aspects of the story, when she could have been an easy replacement for Middle. Him seeing aspects of Middle in Kohaku could have reminded us how much he misses her, and how someone as cold and precise as him still wants to be loved. And her being a parallel to Middle would have made her a perfect fit to be the new host for the Muse, which could have given Asimov a reason to kidnap her. I really don't like the stuff with Middle's brain. I think it's really dumb. Kohaku could have been a beacon of humanity and positivity, constantly driving Copen to express compassion and mercy even to his enemies. The kind of character that could bring out the best of him, and be the spark that reignites his humanity. I'm not sure if this was a cognizant theme when developing this game, but I think the core theme of this story is, or at least should have been, humanity. The idea of what makes us human should be at the center of the minds of both its hero and its villain. Copen and Asimov are both ghosts haunting shells, living far beyond the expectancy of any human. And through Kohaku and Blade could try to keep their bonds to the people they love alive long past them. I feel like that's the story they should have told, about Copen finally seeing humanity in adepts, and through them seeing his own humanity. Maybe that story already happened off screen, but I kind of feel like that's what this character was made for, which is why I find him so frustrating. We finally get it, and it just seems like the story worth telling already happened. Even with all this missed potential, the story does end with some interesting possibilities. With Asimov dead, Blade is now the leader of Sumeragi, and it could be really interesting to see what she does with that power. Whether she tries to wield it as a benevolent ruler, or let it go to establish some kind of democracy. Her trying to hold on to that power could lead to some interesting conflict between her and Copen, where power risks turning her into the exact kind of tyrant she just got finished fighting. The kind of dramatic setup that could make for a really interesting story. Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Avenger X2 doesn't explore any of that. I don't know why they write the endings of these games so that whatever happens next has to be interesting just to sever all ties with it in the next game. Why should I care about how the game ends when it never seems to affect what happens in the next one? I try to be super critical of the stories in the games I review, since I just want every game to have a good story, regardless of genre. With the previous games, I felt like they were worth taking seriously, since there was a lot of creativity on display, and that they were at least trying, but criticizing the story in this game almost feels mean. I can criticize Gunvolt 2 until I'm blue-armed in the face, but I'd never say that game didn't try. LA1 felt like it was barely trying. LA2 feels like it's very adamantly not trying. If the theme of the previous game was humanity, then the theme of this one is surely technology. LA2 could have made a compelling thematic companion to the first, turning the question from the crusty-ass cyborgs losing their humanity to autonomous machines that were never human to begin with. Are the characters of Luminous Avenger 2 human when they have emotions, relationships, thoughts, and feelings? All things more integral to the human experience than having skin or an appendix. Yeah, that could have been cool, but there needed to be a more elegant way to get us there than what we got. Copen, Lola, and Kohaku are just sitting in their living room when a wormhole just sucks them into another dimension. I'm not kidding, like, should I even go on? Kohaku and Copen are trapped in this dimension, and the only way they can get out is through this magic tower. At the base of the tower, Copen crosses paths with Ypsilon, who is the game's rival we'll be refighting over the course of the story, and has no connections to Copen, by the way. So Copen has to fight through waves of sexy robots unlocking sections of the tower so he can get to the top and confront the AI at the center of it all. Mother, who it turns out is a parallel universe version of Lola. Yeah, the cute little buddy character who's always cheering us on and singing little songs. They try to make it this big twist, and I don't see why we should care or be surprised by it. This kind of dimension-hopping plot twist really can't surprise us twice, since our first thought is that the villain is going to be someone we already know. And since Ypsilon is a clone of Copen, it makes sense that the character would be someone connected to him. Am I complaining that foreshadowing is working as intended? There's a difference between foreshadowing and just making a twist completely obvious. I've heard LA2 called a filler episode, and a filler episode of a video game is the kind of thing that I can't for the life of me figure out. The Luminous Avenger storyline is not a story compelling enough to warrant filler. The developers should be trying to convince us every step of the way that this story is worth our time. It's insane that we're in a continuity that doesn't affect the events of the main series, and the developers still don't want to take any risks. I didn't think the first game had a good story, but I was at least curious enough to see what happened next. What's the point of trying to maintain any continuity if you're just going to abandon everything you set up in the next game? It's a serious problem for the series, and I don't know why they keep doing it. My only theory as to why this is that at some point it wasn't going to be a Gunvolt game, that it might have been some kind of standalone Mega Man Zero homage, and for whatever reason they lost confidence in it and decided to strap in everyone's favorite rocket-propelled virgin in to save it. That's the only reason I can think of why they'd continue with this story that's so divorced from the setting they set up in the previous game. I'll give some credit where it's due. This is probably my favorite incarnation of Copen. It might just be the English voice acting, but this version of Copen just comes across as more tired and kind of annoyed, which makes him more endearing to me. But he also seems more curious about his opponents than just bored or filled with disgust, which characterizes him more as a curious and inquisitive scientist who just has a hard time expressing himself. I definitely found myself trying to like him a lot more in this series. I don't know, he just kind of reminds me of someone. This is the version that got me to believe he actually cares about Kohaku, even if she still acts like an alien and is still prancing around in her underwear. I feel like the developers want her to be the grounded character we relate to, but she doesn't act, dress, or talk like a human being, so the 114-year-old cyborg with rocket skates ends up being the more relatable character. I feel mean ragging on her so much, but I just feel like she represents everything I don't like about this series. It really doesn't help that she's trapped in another dimension and is busy wasting her time teaching Null to play rock, paper, scissors in board games. Yeah, she doesn't have anything better to do, but she keeps trying to get Copen to join. I don't hate her, but she's not even my favorite Genki girl named Kohaku in this game. Null, you know why she's in this game. I'll give you 2 guesses. She's a soft-spoken android who works in the tower and is Copen and Kohaku's guide. She's in this game to give fans someone to say their waifu is. They definitely tried to give her a conflict with her being the only robot not to have a dedicated role, but I didn't really care. I will say, her sacrificing herself and erasing her personality so Copen could use the teleporter at the end, while very contrived, definitely affected me more than I thought it would. I just wish the developers weren't very clearly beating off to it.
Only I can handle this much data.
Guys, seriously, come on. Have a little respect for your own characters, or at least save it for Galgun. The final nail in this game's story coffin is that it basically ends on the exact same scene as the first game, just to really nail it in that we're exactly where we started and that no progress has been made whatsoever. It's like they're rubbing it in. Look at Blade. Look how sad she looks she couldn't be in this game. Look, the story's bad, and the quicker we stop talking about it, the happier I'll be. LA2's story may be completely half-assed, but don't let that trick you into thinking the whole game is completely half-assed. Luminous Avenger 2 is actually a much more substantial game when looked at mechanically, and it makes some interesting changes to Copen's mechanics, albeit not always for the better. Alright, the bullet system is out. Copen can no longer fast fall and no longer needs to reload. But the trade-off is that Copen only has 1 air dash now. Connecting with walls and enemies no longer refreshes it. This greatly reduces the momentum his gameplay has, as you constantly need to hit the ground to reset your dash. And the returning Anchor Nexus gives the sense that they understood people really liked it, but maybe didn't understand why, since Copen has to hit the ground before using it again. For whatever reason, his ricochet dash is still intact, so he doesn't have enough fuel to dash twice in the air, but has enough to do this. whatever. One wasted change is that Copen now changes colors when he's out of fuel, so it's way easier to tell when you're out. This is a brilliant visual cue to tell the player when they need to reload, since the player is always going to be looking at Copen, but you never need to reload since you get it back when you hit the ground, and you'll always know when you're out of ammo since you only ever have one dash. You might notice this empty sign that appears every time Copen dashes in the air, which might lead you to believe there's a way to get more fuel, right? Well, there is. In Overdrive, Copen can dash multiple times, but this isn't the same system as the previous game. Copen's ability to dash is represented by this meter. It's constantly depleting after your first dash, but refills after crashing into walls or enemies. So, when you get into Overdrive, he plays a lot more like he did in previous games, and even has some more room as he can dash as many times as he wants as long as the meter's full. LA2 makes some major changes to the Kudos system as there is no style select, and the player just retains their Kudos after getting hit. The only way to interrupt the chain now is by using checkpoints, which also restores your health. So if you want to maintain this state, you need to skip checkpoints. It's a tantalizing incentive to skip checkpoints, but I feel like Copen's core could have been changed in a way that restricts his options without having to nerf it this hard. Like if Copen just had one dash he could maintain by hitting walls and enemies. If the player messed up and missed, they'd need to hit the ground to get their dash back. And then multiple air dashes could be a reward for maintaining Overdrive. The constant need to hit the ground really slows the pace and really makes the levels drag. I remember thinking my final time seemed a lot longer in this one. I also think ditching the old Kudos system was a weird choice since it was something the player could always opt in and out of, and this just subtracts player options. The more punishing Kudos system is available on hard mode, but we'll get to that when we get to it. One of the biggest changes to his playstyles is his new signature weapon, the Razor Wheel. Copen is now partially a melee character. His normal attack is just holding down the wheel in front of it and hoping someone walks into it, but you can mash it to do a quick melee combo. I almost never do this because the finisher on the combo is extremely laggy, even though you can hold it down to keep the Razor Wheel spinning, but bosses rarely ever hold still for it to be much use. The Razor Wheel can also destroy projectiles, which makes it this game's equivalent of the Flash Field, which is also missing in action. Copen can still mark targets, which has the Razor Wheel launch buzzsaws at your target, and for the first time, Copen's basic attack doesn't blot out the bosses. I still wouldn't say it's a very satisfying basic mode of attack, but baby steps, I guess. While firing, the actual blade of the Razor Wheel will stop working, meaning you can't combo and are vulnerable to projectiles. I don't think this is an unfair trade-off, but if Copen put the wheel away during this state, it would better communicate that you can't block attacks anymore, and he could just fire homing shots out of somewhere else in his bulky suit. I've never been very fond of Copen's mechanical characterization. He's all stoic and serious, and yet he's bouncing around on a pair of rocket skates doing backflips like he's Sam Vanquish, when his personality would lend more to a sniper or assassin kind of character. I like to joke about him being this remorseless serial killer, but what kind of characters come to mind when you think of using a saw as their signature weapon? Maybe this guy or this guy? I mean, the nicest character you're gonna get is like either Ash Williams or Jack Kyman, and I mean, it's just not a great fit for his character, and if they needed to give Copen some kind of cutting apparatus, I think it would have been a good idea to give him a kind of sin and punishment gunblade. That would have been badass. The Razor Wheel does have one upside. We've got a bladed weapon, and the bosses are all robots. You know what that means! It's the return of bisection finishes! It's the best of both worlds! It means we get to have bosses be cute robot girls, and we get to cut them in half. It's a weird thing to bring back, but it was always a satisfying way to finish off bosses in the Zero games, and as enemies in the past games were mostly human, you couldn't really justify that without getting an M rating. With Copen's bullet system gone, the series also removed Prevasion, which is really disappointing to me since I've always thought they'd reintroduce it as its own resource, because losing meter or bullets gets in the way of players' decision making. Honestly, I've always felt like Prevasion should just block one attack but refresh over time. With the bullet system gone, I'm disappointed that Prevasion was thrown out with the bathwater, because I think it's a really great idea but still hasn't been executed to its full potential. Look, this doesn't affect me. I don't use Prevasion. You all already know what I think about Prevasion. I always thought Fearless was too punishing, but that Cautious felt kind of arbitrary. Nothing really happens in the game's system if you get hit 3 times. I was always disappointed there wasn't a Kudos system that worked with Prevasion, that would maintain your combo as long as you didn't lose health. Through this system, you could just mash down and regenerate your shield over and over again, but I never really liked that either. If Prevasion was just a separate shield that regenerated as long as you didn't get hit, then players would have a buffer to rely on but still be encouraged to avoid attacks. This would make Prevasion function as a more forgiving Kudos system, giving it a use to intermediate players as well as newbies. I also always felt like there should have been a reward for not having Prevasion equipped. Maybe it takes up a lot of memory and then have some really useful chips you won't have room for if you keep Prevasion equipped. Prevasion has the potential to make the game more fun for players of all skill levels. Low-level players will feel cool using it, and high-level players will feel cool for not using it. And isn't that what video games are all about? making everybody feel cool. The closest thing to Prevasion is Hyperguard, an unlockable that reduces all incoming damage to 1 if you're standing still. It's a first for the series, but does seem weirdly familiar. The subweapons continue in the vein of the previous game, serving purposes outside of dealing damage, like destroying obstacles, alternate movement options, grabbing things from far away. Doomsday Charge was my go-to since it was basically a normal Mega Buster and worked on most enemies. They're fun enough and create an RPS system with other bosses like you'd expect. Nothing as groundbreaking as Anchor Nexus though, but there is a standout among the bunch. The Cryo Flash is an ability that lets the player slow time? I guess it's kind of like freezing time, but only a little bit. Slow motion is the kind of mechanic I feel like shouldn't be thrown into an action game willy-nilly. Generally, I like the game to be designed around it, like in Bayonetta or Katana Zero, but also be designed in a way that playing at the highest skill level involves turning it off, like in Bayonetta or Katana Zero. If you watch speedruns of this game, you're gonna be seeing a lot of the Cryo Flash, and I think the reason it's so overpowered is because it works on every boss and you can use it in tandem with their weakness. If it prevented the player from switching to other weapons, then it wouldn't be such a dominant strategy, and if a mechanic like this has to exist in the series, then I'd rather it be a super that drains from the same resource as your damage dealing super or your heal, so the player needs to decide which one they want to use it on. Could make for some interesting decision making. Obviously, the choice is always yours as to whether or not you want to use it, but I think once the player realizes how good it is, they might just spam it as much as they can. LA2 probably has my favorite roster of bosses in the series, and you can tell that because I actually remembered their names, both in terms of personality and the actual fights themselves. All of the bosses are bipedal humanoids, so we're not in Maverick country yet, but they're all distinctly mechanical. They all have sharp, pale, doll-like faces, which make them recognizable as people, but not necessarily as humans. The boss who has the most unique design is Dacite, whose face is the least human-looking and resembles more of a skull. I think if the bosses featured a few more radical designs like Dacite, it could have created a better sense of variety, because Autochrome and Bridget are designs that feel less inspired to me. By the end of the game, we've already fought a lot of pretty, pale-faced robot people and only one cool hell skull man. Variations in facial structure and body types wouldn't have gone amiss. I think they make a nice change of pace from the repeated Black Sclera Sumeragi designs that almost every boss in the series has had so far. Vespa, Dacite, and Hale are all fun boss characters. Their barks in combat have a cheeky, playful energy that gives them a little extra personality.
It's on the house.
Vespa's prideful sassiness is very endearing and makes her stand out as a favorite. Dacite's crabby aggressiveness is also charming, acting like he's just too old for this crap. While Hale seems like she just wants to find a nice place to take a nap. They're fun boss characters. Bridget, Ace, and Autochrome all take themselves a little too seriously to be much fun. Bridget's voice acting is easily the worst. His weirdly soft line delivery makes me think it's supposed to be ironic, but it just ends up coming across as inept, like they didn't know what this character was supposed to be.
I've been waiting for you. You dirtbags are the grave robbers who felled the captain, aren't you?
Like he isn't a tiny man with a gruff voice or a really angry character with a really squeaky one. I just don't know what they were going for. Autochrome's dialogue is just awful.
I have no need for revenge. There you go, Vespa. I avenged you.
The only thing I like about him is that he's Vespa's big brother, which I think is cute. I gotta give it to Ace's voice actor though. He really played it completely straight despite how ridiculous his lines sound.
This is it. Release full blade. Twin meteor burst. Dance like falling stars.
Who voiced him anyway? What the hell? Most of the bosses use projectiles or ranged attacks to slice up chunks of the screen into safe and unsafe zones. Making attacks very clear and distinct, these get the player to dart around using the dash to get into safe spots before getting hit. And when there are melee attacks, they're usually well telegraphed or reactable. Except for this twerp. I had a very similar experience fighting Autochrome that I had a few bosses in LA1. What I keep calling that good kind of stuck. I actually wanted to learn the boss patterns and kept trying them over and over again until I got them right, rather than just using their weaknesses or heal spamming. I didn't feel as positively about Ace, the other boss I got stuck on. I feel like his attacks are a little too fast, and the hitbox of his boomerazer feels bigger than the animation would have you believe. When the fight works, it can still be really fun. Issues like mark breaking aren't as noticeable as bosses usually break it by going off screen or teleporting, which is how I've always preferred it. Desperation moves are no longer the pace breakers they were in past games. They tend to be way more reactable. A few I thought were almost too forgiving, like the little bombs Vespa drops at the end of hers. They need to land on Copen's head to actually deal damage. Which I guess I don't mind, I just thought it was funny. but I hate aces. I always get hit by this one. Copen's dash has a unique function on the ground as it can launch enemies. I wasn't even going to mention this mechanic because I only ever remembered using it for pushing blocks. But the more I played it, the more I found little moments where I could use it. Dacite, Bridget, and Ypsilon can all be stunned with it. Unfortunately, it's a mechanic that doesn't end up getting that much use, as Ace and Hale are completely immune to it, and Vespa and Autochrome are always in the air. I was kind of disappointed you couldn't beat Ypsilon's dash with your own. It seems like the shonen solution. A few of the DLC bosses make interesting use of it. It's still too contextual and can't be used creatively for me to really praise it as a fun new mechanic to the series. I am happy to see some kind of displacement or hits done, as it's something that can make bosses feel more rewarding by letting the player control the pace of the fight. It's the kind of thing that can work in this game, and I hope to see it more, to make boss interactions more complicated than just dealing damage. Funny, I was playing Mega Man 6 while editing this video, and I noticed that Mega Man also gets a bulky suit upgrade that lets him push blocks. It's just a weird coincidence, but wait a second, Boss Gauntlet actually remixes a few of the bosses, which is nice, and the story acknowledges that the bosses don't die when you defeat them, as they can be re-uploaded into new bodies, meaning that these bosses get a more forgiving fate than any of the child soldiers in the previous games. But it's nice to think that even after we slice them in half, they can still live a fulfilling life, scooping up magma or planting trees or whatever they do. Did you know that Vespa was actually based on an unused boss design for Mega Man 9? Originally, Hornet Man was going to be Honey Woman. There were going to be 2 female robot masters? Imagine that! Hale, on the other hand, was based on an unused boss design from Mighty No. 9. This leads me to believe that Inti Creates has used all their female boss designs and we will never have another girl boss ever again. The fight with the possessed Kohaku is definitely one of the worst bosses in the game. She awkwardly floats around, pelting you with attacks. The biggest problem with this fight is that it's just kind of boring. The final form is actually pretty fun and has some really cool attacks, but what kills this fight is its structure. You spend most of the fight showing down with Lola's big titty cyber goddess form, no complaints here, but after you deplete her health, you have to fight this big server, which only has 1 attack and has a disgusting amount of health. There's nothing engaging about this part of the fight, so there's no reason that it needs to last this long. What's worse is if you survive one phase with MILF Lola, and her server only has 1 hit left, it'll thrust you right back into cyberspace for another round with Mom. The fight takes so long to finish, and she has a really high damage output, and if you die, you have to start the fight all the way back from Kohaku. It's probably still my favorite final boss in the series, though. I should have known something was up when I found out you had to unlock hard mode by collecting all the hidden emblems. Hearing that hard mode also brings lives back into the mix kind of made me feel like I was being lured back into an abusive relationship, so I was in 2 minds about hard mode going in. On one hand, lives are a mechanic that pretty consistently suck all the fun out of action games, but on the other hand, Azure Striker 1 had one of the most enjoyable hard modes I've played in a very long time. You die super quick, but your damage is amped. Checkpoints are frequent, and every obstacle is a sizable threat. Action is tense, but not punishing, and no matter how many times you die, you always spawn at your last checkpoint. A good hard mode will draw out a game's strengths and push the player to the limit of their ability, while a bad hard mode will draw out a game's flaws and push the player to the limits of their patience. Low health, low penalty for dying, high damage output. So how does LA2 stack up? Hard mode scrambles bosses' weaknesses, which is kind of an interesting idea. Hard mode also has all the stages unlocked from the start, so you can fight the bosses in any order, including the fight with Ypsilon. With Copen's insane movements, a lot of threats can be circumvented just by hovering over them. His health isn't anywhere near as low as an AS1, so the moment-to-moment gameplay is less difficult. Checkpoints still heal you, which means that the lowered health is felt even less, and with a more punishing Kudos system, you have less of an incentive to avoid checkpoints since you're not going to be keeping overdrive for very long, making gameplay somehow more punishing without really adding any tension. Once again, upgrades are completely removed, meaning Copen can no longer mark enemies on the ground, making his ground dash completely useless. Yeah, the feature he's had in every game up to this point is now an upgrade, and on hard mode, off limits. You also can't increase your damage output with upgrades, so bosses take forever to kill, and these fights are crazy difficult. You only feel the smaller HP when fighting these guys, and naturally, if you die 3 times, it's back to the start with you. You die faster, but not fast enough for it to make a difference outside of the bosses. Bosses take way longer to kill, so you're more likely to die, which sends you back to the beginning of the stage. So in order to get back to these bosses, you end up just speedrunning stages, playing in the quickest, most reckless way possible to get back to the part you're actually stuck on. Because checkpoints restore your HP, you don't have to play cautiously. I think checkpoints restoring your health would work really well with a low health bar. That way, each decision you make would be super considered and actually getting to checkpoints would feel rewarding. But a system like that would be unplayable with limited lives. Lives turn the moment-to-moment gameplay into a chore you have to get through so you can have a miserable time dying to the bosses over and over again. So, you have a lot of health, a high penalty for dying, with low damage output. LA2 basically does the opposite of what I praised about the first game. I seriously hated playing this game on hard mode. All the tweaks made it into an experience that jarred back and forth between boredom and frustration. The levels weren't difficult to begin with, so when I kept dying to bosses over and over again, the levels just became tedious. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who hated this mode, since the developers later added in a support mode, which brought back healing from the start and gave you 200 lives, to simulate the feeling of not having lives. Even with these extra lives, I still wasn't enjoying hard mode. Some of the bosses were still enjoyable, like Hale, but fights like Bridget and Ace were so much more frustrating on this mode. But I need to acknowledge that last fight with Cope Salon. That was one of the best fights in the series. Part of the reason why lives were tolerable in classic Mega Man was because the levels were so short. But in this game, should I really have to go through another 6 minutes just to die to the boss over and over again? If this was an optional Kudos multiplier you could turn on, I wouldn't care, but since the game thinks hard mode is so much fun, they decided to lock the true ending behind it. I think I'm allowed to express my distaste for it. I restarted on support mode, and by the end I was just spamming Hill to get through the bosses because I wasn't having fun. And yeah, the ending isn't really worth it. I thought I was going to get some answers as to what was going on, like why Lola had boss weapons from Azure Striker 2 or what happened to humanity, but what we get is already obvious. Oh, the creator was probably this dimension's version of Copen, and that robots is people too. Stuff we already knew. Null doesn't die in this timeline, but she doesn't go back with Copen and Kohaku, so she probably won't be showing up in a hypothetical Luminous Avenger 3, which will be about Copen taking Kohaku to Disneyland, and we still won't be able to play as Blade. Hard mode took what was a game I really liked and turned it into easily the most negative experience I've had with this series, because Nova was just two frustrating bosses. LA2's hard mode turns everything into a frustration. I still recommend this game, I just recommend you stay as far away from hard mode as possible if you share my taste or value your time. I just can't understand why anybody would subject themselves to this. Similar to the mainline games, the Luminous Avenger series is very uneven. LA1 feels like a few great ideas being tasked with carrying an entire game, while LA2 feels like a solid action platformer that abandoned those interesting ideas. It's unfortunate because somewhere between 1's momentum and 2's action game fundamentals, there's a really great action platformer there. Overall, as an action game, I think 2 is the better package, better bosses, and while its story is a total joke, it actually manages to build to a more exciting climax. Copen is still a fun character to play, but spending as much time with him in this series has made me a lot more cognizant of his flaws, and it's a shame that this series didn't take this opportunity to really perfect his playstyle. I'm excited to get back to playing as Gunvolt again in Ash 3 as a change of pace from all the Copen this series has had lately. I'm also looking forward to seeing what Kieran's deal is. I'm cautiously optimistic about her. She kind of also reminds me of someone. I'm just not looking forward to the story very much. At this point, I just don't know how seriously they're expecting me to take it when they consistently throw out whatever I might have gotten invested in if it stuck around for more than one game. Luminous Avenger continues the series' trend of one-dimensional villains and support characters who only exist to fillet the player, and moves the story to a separate continuity to ensure that nothing impactful can happen to the story we're supposed to be invested in. I think this game's story might have mattered if it stayed in the mainline continuity, and let us explore the real Copen as a character and show the dark places his worldview can take him. Really look into his history and find out exactly what happened to make him the way he is, and see if he could ever get better. But it doesn't, and because of that, I find it hard to care about as a companion to Gunvolt's story, which wouldn't be a problem if it held up on its own, but if I haven't made that clear yet, it doesn't. Here was the perfect opportunity to explore one of the series' main characters, and they threw it away. And for what? A cheap metatextual twist and some robot coochie. As much as I hate Copen, I still think he deserved better.